Alexander here, and I have the pleasure this morning and the privilege once again have the Dr. Naomi Wolf to talk to us on some constantly we are dealing with some important issues. And what we want to talk today, touch base, time is always of an issue. I think at most we'll do 30 minutes, but we want to talk about the suicides in our children, teenagers. We want to touch base on the miscarriage issue that had been reported in the news. There's a huge problem in terms of the Pfizer, Moderna, mRNA-back COVID injections. And also want to touch on the CDC issues and what is happening right now with the revelation by the CDC director and Fauci as to the problems at CDC. So let me introduce Dr. Wolf. And Dr. Wolf, good morning, and over to you. Thank you.
Good morning, Dr. Alexander. Thank you so much. So I guess we're kind of interviewing each other. So let me ask you, please, to speak about the signal about a rise in teenage girls' suicides and what you think that means, what we should know about it. You're the expert on that.
Well, yes. So, we've been sharing information constantly amongst ourselves as scientists, and there was a paper that CDC had produced in 2021, around June, July of 2021, and buried in it are some lines and some data that they say in the period of 2020 and 2021, there's a sharp increase in suicides among our teenagers, children, particularly pronounced among girls. Mm-hmm. And I think they reported there was a 51% in the 2021 period that they examined, 51% sharp rise in teen girls versus 4% in boys, same age group. I believe they looked at 12 to 17-year-olds. And I think it was buried in the study. And it's something that when you see that kind of information and you realize that it was never even talked about in the media, I didn't see it anywhere. I think somebody had tweeted something some time before, and I went back to find the study. And the reality about it, Naomi, is, and I don't want to step outside of my lane. The reality about it, though, is when I was in the U.S. government, I can just be as open as I can here to say that we were getting catastrophic reporting from the various states across America that the news media, the legacy media in Washington, and it found out across the country and the world, decided that they will not report the traumatic negative data we were getting, because at that point, and this is not about whose politics. I mean, I worked in the Trump administration, but I'm just talking about here as a scientist. At that point, the decision was that Trump was calling out Fauci, Birx, Redfield, the CDC, the teachers' unions to urgently open schools.
Right.
But he was doing that because we were getting very disturbing data coming up from the states. But the media decided they will not tell the public the data because that would make Trump look good. So the public never really understood how catastrophic the lockdowns and school closures were on the society, especially the young people. And I want to let you know that many, many young people in America committed suicide. We know that we had the data, that was just buried. I want to go over to you, Naomi, and hear your thoughts on this.
Sure. I mean, first, can you just surface for me what is the statistic that you found buried in terms of the rise among teenage girls in terms of suicide? I didn't quite catch what the actual number was.
It was during they looked at the 2019 compared to 2020 and 2021. And I think this period was early in 2021. The early months, I think February, March, April, and they found compared to the previous period in 2020, there was a 51% increase in,
oh my God,
in teen suicides.
Wow.
In girls, and a 4% increase in boys.
Did you say a 51% increase for teenage girls and a 4% increase for
Yes,
teenage boys?
yes.
That's extraordinary. Well, a few things come to mind. One is that you're confirming what's emerging in our own data as a vastly disproportionate negative effect on girls and women from the whole array of interventions, from the lockdowns, as you've just described, to the vaccinations, which we'll get to. And this adds just one more piece of a mosaic in which girls and women are suffering and in some cases dying disproportionately from all of these policies. I guess what I would immediately think about as someone who's studied and written several bestsellers about teenage girls is that the home is not a safe place very often for teenage girls. And so locking girls in the home without the support of their social networks and without the support or intervention or oversight of teachers, guidance counselors, principals, it can be very dangerous because over 30% of girls and women have experienced sexual abuse by the time they are adults. And very often that's from a trusted male relative in the home. So it could be a stepfather, it could be sometimes, God forbid, a father. I mean, all of it is equally bad. You know, a brother, a cousin. The point is, girls at home are not necessarily safe. There's also domestic violence, which disproportionately affects girls and women. And when there's violence in the home, even if it's, you know, just as traumatic as witnessing, say, a mother being attacked, mother being assaulted, beaten, intimidated, menaced, very common. When a teenage girl is going to school, focusing on her studies, you know, playing sports, able to go to a school guidance counselor, or just the family has eyes on it, right? Through, I don't mean in a surveillance creepy way, but just, you know, checks and balances, you know, duty to report. Then these girls are much safer. And in terms of the trauma they may experience at home, they have other ways of building resiliency and seeing a way forward and surviving. But if you're locked in an abusive home, and, you know, again, you know this, the numbers for, you know, sexual or physical abuse are catastrophic, even without the extra pressure of lockdown, which saw physical and sexual abuse escalate, right? You know, battered women were not able to be safe. They were especially endangered during the lockdown. Well, then you've got a pressure cooker in which, you know, there is no escape. So I'm not surprised that a finding is that there was near an over 50% rise in teenage girls' suicide. What would you think? Where would you go? You're 14, 15, 16 years old. You don't know how the world works. You know, you haven't been allowed to go to school for a chunk of your life, whether, you know, critical period in high school. Where will you go if your mom's being beaten up, or if you know, an older cousin is forcing you to, you know, have intercourse with him, or, you know, the many horrible things that happen to girls? There would be nowhere to go. There would be no one to reach out to. What are you going to do? You know, call the police? That's not going to happen. You know, at school, you could tell a friend, you could tell a trusted teacher, you could tell a guidance counselor. That was not an option. And I just want to say also, I'm good friends with a teacher here in my little rural community, and she said, she's a high school teacher, and she said that during the lockdowns, troubled kids just dropped through the cracks. You know, the kids that the teachers knew they needed to keep a nurturing eye on, kids who came to school neglected or with bruises, or, you know, without the proper, you know, eye care or dental care, you know, at-risk kids, they just vanished. And there was no mechanism for finding them, right? They would just not be on the Zoom calls. They would be lost to the system. You know, there weren't truancy officers who were visiting. There weren't social support people who were visiting. Remember, all of that was shut down. So they lost teenagers. And what I'm trying to say is, some of those teenagers could have been kids who committed suicide. You know, some of them would be kids who ran away, you know, or were trafficked. I mean, there would, you know, schools aren't just schools. They're also a social safety network for at-risk kids. And that was stripped away in the lockdowns.
No, I think you're right. And, you know, when you read the report, you're talking about suicidal ideation, attempted suicide. I mean, The reality about it is, I agree with so much that you say, and you likely have more connection, more detailed information too on that side. The point is that when we see these types of reports, they may not be bulletproof yet. One report does not make a final conclusion. That's where we need confirmative or more definitive follow-up research. We need to drill a little deeper into the science, into the data. But it's a really serious signal and flag, and that we need to pay attention to. And to say that over 50% of girls thought about suicide, attempted suicide, committed suicide, anyhow you want to frame it. The thing is, I want to share this, that I'm very happy what you said, in the sense that you understand what I wanted to also share today. You was out of my mouth, in the sense that the fact of the matter is that when we close schools, exactly what you just said it, schools is actually are much safer for children than oftentimes their own homes.
Right.
And many children, we depend on the school to capture or to see or notice physical abuse in the home, sexual abuse. I mean, it's a very terrible thing to be talking about, but the reality about life is it happens. We need the
Mhm.
schools. And I'll tell you, I'll remind some of the viewers this, that one of the very disturbing types of reports that we were getting during I would say maybe around June, July of 2020. So maybe about 4 months after the lockdowns began and people were laid off, etc. We had parents who, husbands and wives, were turning up to different emergency rooms
Mm.
across, reporting to the nurses and doctors that they think they may have killed their child.
Good
They would
God.
have they would have their child with them, often unresponsive, in their arms, saying, we have to say that we have been physically violent with each other because we've been laid off. We're fighting. We're going at each other every day, husbands and wives. And today we crossed the line and we beat the child, and the child had broken bones, unresponsive. This was real. And this is why you saw Scott Atlas, Dr. Atlas, who was maligned in the media unfairly. This was a really, really technically sound guy to the media. This is why you had myself hammering CDC behind the scenes and the
Right.
unions, because we were seeing this data and it is
Wow.
trauma. And I don't know, Dr. Wolf, how would you think post, because look, now we are in August of 2022. Some modelers say that we will probably never get back to the footing of the United States was January 2020 for the balance of the century. They're saying 80 years it will take
Wow.
us for us to get back to even where we were, particularly in terms of the psychological, emotional, social damage done to children.
Right.
What do you say about that?
Well, I see it every day. I don't know if it will be even possible in 80 years, because I think what you've got is a massive PTSD event. And it's worse on children. These lockdowns were worse for children, and the masking, which we haven't discussed, worse than a conflict zone, worse than a war or a famine. So many studies, and I write about this in the Bodies of Others,
Yes.
show, and I've been to many conflict areas around the world as a reporter, kids are incredibly resilient, even in the middle of war, even in the middle of bombs dropping around them, if they've got their community, if they've got their parents and their parents are connected to community, and they've got their friends and their friends are connected to community. Kids and communities ultimately survive psychologically intact, everything from world wars to natural disasters. I'm not saying it's fun for them, but they grow up to be resilient, productive people if the communities and their families are intact. And study after study shows this. But study after study also shows, and this is why solitary confinement is against the Geneva Conventions, and the Red Cross, International Red Cross, prohibits solitary confinement. Even one day in solitary confinement has lasting effects in terms of mental health. And so now you've got a year of isolating a family, or over a year of isolating a family, closing down all of the ways that an abusive or impoverished family might be supported at church once a week, seeing community, remembering there are other people out there to help them, having a break. I mean, anyone who's ever had one, let alone two small children in an apartment, in bad weather, will know how difficult it is psychologically to be alone with two small children, for hour after hour after hour, let alone never to be able to take them to the park because the park is roped off, never to be able to go have that play date with another single mom. I mean, we haven't even talked about single parents here, right? Like, if you're an exhausted single mom or single dad, you're trying to figure out how to pay the bills, you've been laid off, you may be self-medicating, or you may not have been able to get your, anxiety meds or your depression meds, addressed because you haven't been able to see the doctor because no one's there to look after your child, right?
Yeah.
Or your kids, they're plugged into a distance learning thing if they're 5 years old, which is not a thing, how many of these otherwise wonderful single parents might go over the edge and, injure a child, hurt a child, sedate a child just so they can get some sleep or some rest or get some work done. I mean, as a feminist, it's incredible. And I'm not saying it's okay. I'm just saying it's predictable that some kids will get hurt or neglected or bullied or traumatized, even if they're not physically, menaced or harmed, by being locked in a set of rooms, essentially, with one or two parents who also are trying to meet other commitments or who have been laid off. And that's so predictable. It's an experiment that's never been done before in human society, certainly not in the free West. And so the trauma of that, not for one day, not for a week, but for months and months during formative periods in these kids' lives, I don't know how those relationships will really be repaired, right? And how kids will grow up feeling like the world is a safe place that makes sense. Then there's the masking. And again, I go into this in detail on the bodies of others. That's straight up child abuse. And kids were forced to struggle for breath, not able to run around freely, develop freely, not able to learn social cues, not for one day, not for a week, but for months and months and months. To this day, they're being threatened with masking in Philadelphia, in California. So what kids are learning right now is that adults are not safe, and that adults are crazy and don't make sense, and that governments are crazy and don't make sense. And I can't think of a scarier message to give to kids, because a child in an abusive home where, policies are saying it's not okay to abuse your child, they grow up thinking there's some reason in the world makes sense. I don't see how this generation of children is going to grow up and look back on this time, unless we emerge from it and have prosecutions and sentencing, without feeling like existentially the world is a chaotic and irrational and punitive place, and that most adults in authority are in on it and willing to torture and abandon children. So I'm not surprised that it'll take at least 80 years to recover.
The thing about, we're talking about topics here that are so harrowing, and you always add a dimension and you explain it and unpack it in a way that even I myself, sometimes I have to sit back and think of what you just said, because I learned how you explain. And I want to also add now to something you said, because Jeff Tucker at Brownstone Institute wrote some papers with myself, and we published recently 2 to 3 articles in Brownstone about the rise in mass shootings. Is very, very, I think, ties to this in the United States. Because what we're seeing is a situation of 18, 17, 18, 19-year-olds committing these heinous crimes. I mean, I don't want to use the wrong terms, but let's say we're starting off with very deranged, if you want to use the term evil. I don't want to say a child is evil. I think all children start good and are wonderful, clean, beautiful. Something happens somewhere. But what I wanted to say is this. If you read the manifesto of the Tops Buffalo grocery shooter, that guy who shot the 10 people in the grocery. I mean, he said in his manifesto, he wrote that I was not a monster the way I have become now. He wrote this before he committed the act. He said, I was locked down. My schools were closed.
Right.
I had no alternatives. I had nowhere to turn. And because of that, what he was telling us, if you read it, was then he said, I had time. I had time that I never had before to go and visit very dark, evil websites. And in those websites, it poisoned my mind. I learned things about different ethnicities and stuff that I never knew. People told
Mm,
me things and it poisoned me and I became the monster that I am. And that's the key, the lockdowns and the school closures. Even the guy who shot up the kids in Uvalde, Texas,
mm,
his school was open, close, lockdowns, reemerged from lockdowns, back into lockdowns.
God.
And if you followed his life, the range, terrible what he did, devastating, and there must be harsh accountability. Um, you could see that at a certain point when his schools reopened, he just dropped out.
Sure.
And record shows that, but nobody missed him. Nobody cared. And that's the point. School is really the flag and a very important place where you could see certain things happening. But you know, time is always of an issue. Um, that's a good flag. We have serious problems that have happened to our young people, particularly if we tease the data apart differentially by gender, etc., by age. We would see that uh, particularly I've realized that COVID, Naomi, is a disease of disparity, and
Right.
it has hit segments of society differentially.
Sure.
It hit women differently,
Yeah,
females
absolutely.
and men,
Yeah,
particularly young women and our children. And I
yeah,
think that's going to be the legacy, and that is something we have to fix
right.
and really study the data. But I wanted you to get into, because I don't want us to lose time, this this issue, the not issue, but this situation with the rise in miscarriages and in the data and stuff. Could you just help update us on where that is today, please?
Sure, absolutely. And thank you for giving me the opportunity. Well, Daily Clout, as you know, and War Room have a project in which 3,500 highly credentialed researchers, ranging from physicians and RNs to biostatisticians, medical fraud investigators, lab clinicians, are have volunteered to read through the Pfizer documents. So they've and to issue reports that anyone can understand. And these are all on our website, dailyclout.io.
Yes.
So they've issued over 30 reports, almost 160 pages of analysis of what's in the Pfizer documents that were released under court order. So they broke some very important stories about reproductive harms, which I will get to. And they showed a 360-degree attack on human reproduction documented in the Pfizer internal records. But one of our volunteers did make a mistake. And the mistake she made was in a report that I posted last Thursday, I believe, that said that she concluded there were 44% miscarriages out of a set of pregnancies in one section of the Pfizer documents. So she miscounted. She mistakenly counted this. She didn't notice that the same subjects were in two different tables. So what was probably 11 out of 50, depending on one analyst, or 11 out of 58, depending on another analyst, or 11 or 12 out of 88, which are own analyst, separate from this author, looking at the same material, she concluded it's not 44% in that section. It's more like 18%.
Yes.
However, criticism, so we immediately corrected it as soon as this was brought to our attention. I'm a responsible journalist, of course, and if there's an error, I corrected it once, I corrected it publicly, and I went on a bunch of news sites and podcasts, corrected the error, issued a correction. That said, right now, Daily Clout is facing some pretty inaccurate blowback at a very big level for that mistake. And even though it was corrected over a week ago, or nearly a week ago, and I regret to say that the blowback and the criticism are obscuring many, many other important signals of high miscarriage and spontaneous abortion rates, both in the Pfizer documents and in the VAERS data. And so may I speak to that? Because basically, as a woman, what I'm seeing is a very misogynist kind of jumping on this one mistake that she shouldn't have made, but that one of our volunteers made, immediately corrected. And AP and Reuters and Alex Berenson, are using that to erase this vast array of other documentation that we have, and now that Dr. Corey has, and that doctors in Ontario and now in Australia have, in the VAERS data have, showing a very problematic relationship to miscarriage and spontaneous abortion. So can I speak to the evidence that we have in addition to that?
Yes, please.
I will. So let me start by saying that one of our most distinguished volunteers, Dr. Robert Chandler, who has had a long, illustrious career in sports medicine, teaching, doing peer review, member of many august, medical bodies. He treated the Lakers, he treated the Angels, sports teams. He has looked at the biodistribution data in the Pfizer documents and found, confirmed something that was identified over a year ago by Brett Weinstein and by Bridle and Steve Kirsch from a Japanese study, which is that the lipid nanoparticles, the spike protein and the mRNA leave the injection site quickly and distribute throughout the body. But what he found, and again, confirming what the Japanese study found over a year ago, is that these materials quickly, within 15 minutes, but certainly within 48 hours, accumulate in a number of organs. But the top 4 organs are the liver, the adrenals, the spleen, and the ovaries. And what he found with the ovaries is very, very, very concerning, because the ovaries, even more than the testes, in his chart, it's a sharp rise to the right over time, over this 48-hour period of this Pfizer experiment, whereas the amount leaving the injection site is going down to the right over the same period of time. So he calls it the from and the to graph. It's going from the injection site to the ovaries in this case. And what's very disturbing is that we don't see yet in the Pfizer documents any mechanism for these materials leaving the ovaries, right? So you only, like, the ovaries are very important. And I can't believe that you and I are some of the few people who, recognize how delicate the female reproductive system is and how easy it is to ruin it. But basically, spike protein, which you've identified as a toxin, other doctors have identified as a toxin, lipid nanoparticles, which scare me to death because they're an industrial fat coated with polyethylene glycol, a petroleum byproduct, and they are designed to cross membranes in the human body, right? They cross the blood-brain barrier, they're crossing the placenta, right, which we'll get to, but they're also accumulating in the ovaries, and the mRNA, which God knows what it does over time. These are accumulating in the ovaries with the first injection. So my point is, with the second injection, from everything we can see, there's more that's going to accumulate in the ovaries. Then you add the booster. As far as we know, more will accumulate in the ovaries. Then you add the next booster. And to this day, this morning on my Getter feed, people are sending me ads from the NHS saying, are you pregnant? Protect your baby with these injections, get a booster. So for all we know, they're up to 5 injections in Israel. All of these, for all we know, we see no mechanism by which the ovaries can discard this material. This material is accumulating in the ovaries. So what is it doing to the ovaries? We have no idea. But among other things, the ovaries have to send the eggs traveling through the fallopian tubes. And we have no idea what packing the ovaries with an industrial fat, let alone a toxin like spike protein, will do to that delicate process. But what we do know is that women are also, and I was deplatformed over a year ago for being the first national reporter to identify this signal. I noticed over a year ago on Twitter that women were reporting menstrual harms. Okay, well, let me get to that. You know, if you don't mind my 360-degree kind of addressing of what we're finding. I was deplatformed. Alex Berenson called me batshit crazy, I believe, and counterfactual. Media Matters made fun of me. Well, people should have paid attention then and not deplatformed me. And it turns out the CDC, Carol Crawford at the CDC was coordinating with Twitter to deplatform me for that tweet about menstrual harms. Over a year later, it turns out that the NIH, multiple studies have confirmed menstrual harms to women due to this mRNA injection. So we've found much more evidence of how the menses are damaged by these mRNA injections in the Pfizer documents. And again, Dr. Chandler's latest breakdown shows, and I just did a video on this, about 20 different categories of menstrual harms in the Pfizer documents. 16% of the adverse events total for women are reproductive disorders versus 0.49% of the total adverse events for men. And he also found that 72% of the adverse events were sustained by women. And this confirms a study out of Switzerland showing 69.2% of the adverse events are sustained by women. So women are being harmed disproportionately by the mRNA injections, and a vastly disproportionate percentage of the adverse events are reproductive disorders in women compared to men. And so now getting to the menstrual problems, I mentioned 20 different categories in the Pfizer documents. Dysmenorrhea, no menses, light menses, 2 menstrual cycles a month, menstruating when you're long menopausal, interperiod bleeding, which we know is always a danger signal, clotting when you're bleeding. And these are things that women were reporting anecdotally, but Pfizer knew. Pfizer knew there were thousands and thousands. I think there are almost 30,000 cases of menstrual harms in the Pfizer documents alone. And again, 16% of the total adverse events were reproductive disorders in women. So now let's go to why that matters. And you're the medical doctor, I'm not a medical doctor, but I took 8th grade biology and I'm a woman. When there's so much dysregulation and destabilization of the uterine lining, right, which is what the menstrual bleeding is, it's the sloughing of the uterine lining. By definition, something is affecting the uterine lining, right? By definition, if you've got a postmenopausal woman whose uterine lining is bleeding, something has wrongly destabilized the lining of her uterus. So that poor egg, if it can even get past the lipid nanoparticles, get past the mRNA, get past the spike protein, make its way through the fallopian tubes and implant, meat with an impaired sperm, which we'll get to. Andrology shows that semen has been impaired by the injections, and other evidence in the Pfizer documents also shows impairments to testes, to the epididymis, to semen, to ejaculate, which should disturb men. But say an actual, sperm meets an actual egg in an mRNA vaccinated woman's, womb. It suggests that it won't implant well if there's so much destabilization of the uterine lining, because the zygote has to implant in the uterus. Now let me go on. So Dr. Chandler has found one possible mechanism, and a vast amount of Pfizer knowing that there were harms to women reproductively, vastly outstripping by a factor of over 30 the harms to men reproductively. Now let's go to the placenta. I mentioned that the lipid nanoparticles traverse every membrane in the human body. Well, pregnant women were told, take the injection, it doesn't affect your baby. This was a lie, and they knew it. Lipid nanoparticles were initially developed to traverse the blood-brain barrier and bring medicine to brain tumors. And that's a serious cost-benefit analysis. You're going to die from a brain tumor. You might as well take the risk. But healthy women are having these lipid nanoparticles injected that are traversing every membrane in the human body. The placenta is a membrane.
Yes.
So we know that the lipid nanoparticles, the vaccine material, studies are showing this, are entering the amniotic fluid. They're in the fetal environment. They're in the umbilical cord, right? Other studies have shown that the ingredients of vaccine are in the umbilical cord. Well, they're not looking to see if lipid nanoparticles are in babies, but we know that lipid nanoparticles traverse membranes, so they will, enter the amniotic sac. So
Yes.
the last thing I want to mention, high miscarriage and spontaneous abortion rates.
It's Naomi Wolf of Daily Clout, and I am asking you to please, if you like the video you just saw, support us, become a member, donate. You can send checks to P.O. Box 24, Millerton, New York, 12546, or go to Daily Clout, DAILYCLOUT, become a member or donate. Thank you so much for your support. Every penny goes for paying our hardworking staff, paying hosting costs, and paying our lawyers who have been leading the fight to keep you safe and free, to keep the Constitution safe and to keep you free.